So today we have somebody that's looking to get to do their qualified speech. It is our current club growth director for District 12, and she'll be presenting to us a topic that is very personal, but also very relevant to today, with the title of her speech, The Last Time, Sarah Cairney.
I remember the last time. I remember the last time I hugged my big sister. My sister, Melissa, is a whopping 21 years older than I am. And in those last moments, I said a final goodbye. Melissa is the middle sister. There are 5 of us. I am the baby by a wide gap. And growing up, she was always off kind of doing her own thing. I found out later that her childhood was very different from mine. We grew up in 2 very different households. Her childhood was rough. And at the age of 15, Melissa started using drugs. That last time we were together, I took the moment and I hugged her. But in those last few hours, she was paranoid and scared and talking about the wires in the walls. She was 40. I was 19. A few weeks later, I got a phone call from my older brother, Jim. Now, it was late. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was studying for a psychology exam the next day. Now, my brother never called. He wasn't that kind of person. He was a trailer in the middle of the desert kind of guy. So I instantly knew something was wrong. I took the phone downstairs and I gave the phone to my father, who gratefully was hard of hearing because I could hear the whole conversation. She's gone. Melissa had taken her own life just a few weeks after the last time I saw her. She was in a place where she was feeling lost and alone and isolated, and finally took that last step that we didn't think she was going to do. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. And my family tried to piece together what had happened. Years later, right after the birth of my son, I had a moment. I was suffering from postpartum depression, and I was feeling myself go into these dark places. I had figured out that if I was to put the baby down, go into the kitchen, my ex-husband would be home in time before the baby woke up. I remembered back to that last time, to those days following my nieces, my siblings, my father, who never cried. And I kept myself together. But I had gotten there. Working as a nurse in the hospital, I worked in the emergency department. We saw attempts time after time after time. We saw successes time after time after time. The CDC says that there are 46,000 deaths each year from suicide. That's 1 death every 11 minutes. It's the leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 64. That means that One of us, about 50% of us, so the person to your left or the person to your right, 50% of us have had some sort of impact from suicide. We've known someone. Those are staggering numbers. And there's even more attempts. The suicide rate increased from about 30% from 2000 to 2020. That year, obviously, I think there was something that happened. There was a moment there where things were isolated and dark. So what causes this? What puts people at risk to take their own life? What puts people at risk to have their family at a place where they say, I had the last time? Well, we find that teens and young adults are the highest risk. Those that are in those formative years, developing and growing. People who are in our LGBTQIA+ community, particularly those that are transgender. People who are bullied, which makes sense if you look at those two numbers together. That bullying can tear someone down to a place where they're so dark. It's even worse if it comes from a close family member or a close friend, someone we care about. People who are in areas of disparity or have disparities, poverty, trauma. We often see clusters, communities that are at higher risk due to the violence in the community. That community can cause more danger to the people in there because they have lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to therapy, psychiatry, and then day-to-day violence can create a further impact and issue. We find that people who are in a domestic violence situation are at a high risk. People who are abused, both children and adults. And one of the first things that happens in an abuse situation is isolation. They're alone, and that loneliness, that feeling of not being connected to someone leaves them feeling that there's no choice. I remember one night in a rare emergency department night of not being crazy busy, I sat with a patient of mine. We'll call her Jane. And Jane had just made an attempt on her own life. And I sat with her for about 30 minutes, just talking. What happened? What got you here? And she shared with me a life of tragedy, of pain, of domestic violence in her home, and of feeling abandoned and alone. After sitting with her, she told me she felt better and that she was going to get help. That warmed my heart. Because often when we look at these moments, we have a stigma. When we start talking about mental illness, immediately people want to turn and walk the other way. When I bring up this topic, I find several responses. Some people, yeah, great, and keep walking. They don't want to talk about it. It's not an easy thing to talk about. We often find as well, when people reach out and try to get help, they're judged. We tell someone that I'm feeling bad, down, dark, lonely, hurt, sad, depressed, and we're met with walk it off. I was told that when I finally reached out. If you were serious, you would have done it by now. Completely dismissed. I will say that in a way was kind of helpful because then I became very stubborn to that person. I'm not going to do it because you told me to. I'm a little stubborn, just a little. But in those moments, in those dark places, we find that the only way out, it becomes the only choice to the person in that moment. And often when we're looking for signs, we expect people to be crying and sad and not getting out of bed. But often people are awake and excited. They almost seem like they're happy or in a good mood. Sometimes it's hard to see beyond the mask of what's happening in their life. So reaching out and paying attention, but in those moments, it's hard. So what do we do? How do we get to a place where we're not just looking at 46,000 deaths per year? How do we get to a place where we're at 20,000, 10,000, 5,000? Numbers that drastically decrease. The CDC has proclaimed this an emergency, as an epidemic, as something to be looked at and evaluated and treated. That Centers for Disease Control really has put a spotlight on suicide prevention. So my fellow Toastmasters, I want to bring to you guys some hope. What do we do to get into those moments, to start changing the world that we're in? It starts by talking about it. I got this sweatshirt just to start conversations. It starts by bringing it up. You are enough. Dear person behind me, the world is a better place with you in it. Getting to a place where we can be that outreach and that moment for others, where we can have that conversation in a grocery store, maybe be that inspiration to someone. We often find as well, as we get into these topics, that they're hard, but what can we do to change it? One of the big ones is developing coping mechanisms. Wonderful coping mechanisms. Something happened today, it was a bad day, and so I am going to grab that bottle of wine. No, am I the only one? Bottle of wine? Shot of Jack with, right. I'm gonna move into a place where I'm going for something that's gonna make me more down, or I'm gonna dissociate on social media, flipping through the screen, watching who knows what, depending on the day. Getting ourselves to a place to develop solid coping mechanisms. Now, they don't teach these in school. They teach reading and writing and arithmetic. We don't learn how to deal with a bad day. We often learn that from our parents who, let's be honest, are struggling just as much as we are. So we need to heal and learn these for ourselves. Meditation, journaling, talking to a friend, taking that walk, really looking at what you do when something is bad or wrong or terrible. Do you hide from your feelings or do you feel them? Do you let that come up? Do you work through it? Do you find that therapist when things are just a little too hard? We talked about the stigma of mental health. We often cut ourselves off at the head. We would never treat someone with a broken femur by telling them to walk it off. We would never treat someone with diabetes with a, you'll get over it. We often treat these medical diseases very differently than we do mental illness. How do we eradicate that stigma? Dr. Daniel Amen does brain scans on all of his patients. And when he does these brain scans, he can see in the brain the areas of trauma, the areas that are highlighted by depression, and the areas that are activated when we have any sort of mental illness, schizophrenia. It's a disease. Brain disease is the term that he has coined. not mental illness, not some other idealized moment. Brain disease, a disease much like diabetes, high blood pressure. These are diseases, and they need to be treated as such. And people who are seeking help need to be treated as any other patient would. Let them come in, get help, get that moment, receive that therapy that they need without judgment or stigma, without feeling like the world is against me because I'm seeing a therapist. I remember the first time I told my mother, she's in her 80s, that I was going to go to a therapist. That went over like a whopping ton of bricks. The look I got was, what are you talking about in there? So me and all my personality went, you, actually. We talk about you. She didn't like that answer. But the reality was, I was talking about other things. I was going through a divorce. I was a single mom. I needed someone to talk to. And she finally came to terms with that it wasn't something wrong with me. I just needed some help. Another factor is having something to live for. What is the one thing, two things, three things, four things that you live for? Anyone? I live for my 10-year-old son. I'm assuming Marjorie lives for Toastmasters. That purpose, that moment is so important. And when we're in those moments of darkness, of down, of sadness, saying, I'm here for this person, for this reason. I remember back to the time I saw my niece after the last time I saw my sister and where she was at emotionally. She was down, she was drained, she was exhausted, she was tired and sad. I couldn't do that to someone else. Knowing what I knew, that couldn't happen. So it gave me a power to say in those moments, this is what I live for. Making sure that no one else in my family feels like that, has those days. And often we see people with family trauma struggling with trying to get through the grief and the sadness, but being there for them in that moment can make all the difference in the world. Having community and connectedness with others. I think my favorite analogy for this is, does everyone remember Eeyore? Eeyore was always down and sad and depressed, and yet his friends would come and they would take care of him and they would include him and they would be excited to see him and give him love. Thanks for noticing me. But that connectedness, that power of friendship really does make a difference in the life of those that we're with. Having people to go to, having people to talk to, having a meeting to show up at can make all the difference in the world. And of course, sharing our stories and our resources. At this point in time, I have a resource for you. There is a hotline, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The number is 988. Take out your phones, if you haven't already, or write it down somewhere. Put that in writing and keep it in your back pocket. Put it in your phones. 988. That is a number that you can call for resources for help. And it's a quick number. It's very similar to our 911. Everyone should know that one for the most part. 988. A way to bring people help when needed. Guidance, resources, not needing the Google machine right then and there. keep that number with you and share that. If you know someone that's struggling or having a hard time, or if you get to that place, having those resources. Setting up a safety plan is another moment. So if you can be a friend's safety plan, the safety plan is, I know I'm in this moment. I'm going to call Suzanne and she's going to help me through it. She's going to be my resource. Setting those things up and talking about all these things and using those numbers. And maybe, just maybe, one more person won't have to have the last time. Thank you.